Hello there, and welcome to my video about what is blockchain. I feel like there are a lot of people out there, and maybe you're one of them, that every time somebody says the word blockchain or gets excited about the word blockchain, your eyes glaze over and you're like, oh my god, here we go again, something I have no idea what they're talking about. May as well be a Martian. Yeah, hi, I'm that person on the other end that is receiving that and saying, okay, we just need to do a better job about educating people what it is on like a chill level in the first place. So here we go. I think in order to best do this, we should jump into a time machine and go back, like way the heck back into time, where there's a landscape and people are straight up in like ancient Egypt or wherever, and they've got stone tablets that they're keeping ledgers on. Because all a blockchain is an immutable, supposed to be, ideally, securely, an immutable ledger system. So think about that, immutable ledger system. So going way back into time, back into like ancient days where there's stone tablets that people are etching records into, etching a ledger of transactions into, because even way back in the day, people were trading all the time. People even had really early forms of currency, and every time that currency changed hands, every time goods and services changed hands, a lot of times there was a ledger being kept of those transactions. Just like we do today when you buy your cup of coffee with your credit card, or when you go and enter into, like, make a will for your family, make a contract with your family. All those records are being logged somewhere on some type of ledger system. So from way back in the day on stone tablets to papyrus to eventually paper, there's been records of transactions happening. And eventually you get to the point where computers are invented. And then computers are invented, and there's lots of transactions happening at this point globally for the most part, so there's a lot more record keeping that needs to be done and housed. And oftentimes those records to this day are still kept on spreadsheets, like Microsoft Excel spreadsheets, when there's a bunch of transactions happening, like via your bank or via a certain legal office, or between businesses, between individuals, between governments. All those transactions, all those contracts, all those monetary exchanges are being, all the records of it are being held on a ledger system, typically Microsoft Excel, some type of spreadsheet. And then that spreadsheet is usually held, because there's so many of it, because the volume is so high now, those spreadsheets, those ledgers are now usually kept in centralized servers. So for instance, like Google has a ton of data transactions that it's responsible for maintaining because of audit reasons, that it's responsible for maintaining because of running a smooth business. And so what Google does is they take all that information that's constantly being exchanged in their environment, and whenever you use a Google product, they're taking all those transactions, storing it in a database on a server somewhere. And a lot of times they use, big companies especially, will use cloud computing and cloud servers, so it's not all on one physical vulnerable server somewhere. That's how it used to be, where all this data would be on one physical server room somewhere, but if somebody bombed that server room, all that data is lost, right? So it's pretty vulnerable. It's one single point of vulnerability. So with cloud computing, you took that ledger maintenance to a whole different level, because you could now transfer, like constantly be migrating and transferring all of that data to different servers that communicate from around the entire world. And that's how a lot of companies do it. But a lot of companies have the money to pay for extra access to extra servers to be able to keep moving the data around and trying to keep it more secure. So if one server farm is bombed, it's not a single point of vulnerability, because that data is backed up on the cloud basically by other servers that are scattered throughout the world, right? So it makes it more secure. But the part of that that's still kind of frustrating to a lot of us is the fact that, okay, all that data is still being housed and maintained and controlled. The custodians of it are usually big governments, big companies like Google, like Facebook, and all that kind of stuff. So blockchain came along to kind of give more power to the people, so to speak. Because instead of having to have enough capital, enough money to be able to afford large servers to house your data in different places, or instead of you having like the worry and the vulnerability of trying to store all of your personal data on your own home computer with that potential single point of vulnerability, blockchain came along, was like, well, let's just distribute this responsibility across as many what's called nodes as possible. So a node, instead of again being a big server farm scattered throughout the country or the world, nodes are initially were individual computers, and still can be initially individual computers scattered throughout the world. And so what they do is, like in the Bitcoin network, for instance, there's a lot of transactions happening that need to be stored and maintained on a ledger. And so those transactions, every time you would potentially buy a cup of coffee with Bitcoin, or send so many Bitcoin to your friend Joe, got coffee, I didn't even notice that was about to happen. I guess that's a Freudian slip. Anyways, but anytime you wanted to send Bitcoin to your friend Joe, all those transactions are being logged on the Bitcoin blockchain, on the Bitcoin ledger system. And what that ends up doing is it puts transactions into a block. Instead of storing it like on a spreadsheet in that type of format, what happens is those transactions are loaded into a block, and then once what's generated is called a hash. It's like a fingerprint. So think of it this way, like you as a human being, this meat suit that you were given for your existence on Earth in this lifetime has a very unique fingerprint. None of us have the same fingerprint, just like none of us have the same, like, I think iris or eye distribution of like color and everything, right? But we'll go with fingerprint because I think that's more related to. So your human body has a unique fingerprint to it, and in the blockchain world, if you were a block, you would have a unique hash associated with yourself. So what you do is you take that block of information, you generate that unique hash using what's called a SHA-256 hashing algorithm. It's a computer process. It's honestly pretty easy for a lot of computers. Like if you send a text message, like you're doing something almost as difficult to do for a computer. Like it's just, so the algorithm takes all of the information that's in the block, all of the transactions, all those cups of coffee you bought with Bitcoin that are now loaded on this ledger, loaded in this block, and it takes a hash of it, a fingerprint of it, and that hash then gets loaded into the next block, which is what links it. So that it becomes a blockchain, a chain of information. So that would be like you and a bunch of friends getting together and putting your fingerprints together and making a chain of humans, a chain of physical flesh information from person to person, linked by the hash, linked by your fingerprints. That's the only thing that's touching the next round of information. But because the hash, that fingerprint of this one person, this one block, is being placed in the next block, that acts as a reference to the previous block in the chain, which allows them to eventually all be linked together. So you're like, okay, that sounds kind of interesting, but why is it important? Why is it important that we keep this information in a blockchain instead of with a bunch of different businesses and spreadsheets and all that stuff, or maybe on your home computer? Again, on your home computer, you have a single point of vulnerability. With some companies, depending on how small they are, you might have a single point of vulnerability there as well. And a lot of it comes down to trust at the end of the day. A lot of times you'll hear the word trusted and trustless thrown around in the blockchain world. And what we're referring to is not far off of what you would relate to between human beings in a way. It's like a lot of people, there's a lot of controversy about how much you should be trusting Facebook with your information and your data, or trusting large tech companies, or even some governments. Like there's a lot of governments out there across the board, first world through third world, that, you know, arguably aren't the most trusted by a lot of their people. So instead of giving them the privilege of maintaining a lot of your private data that you think is important, the blockchain gives you the ability to help control it through people that you don't even know throughout the world that must adhere to the rules of the blockchain in order to maintain that data. So in other words, there's all these transactions happening in Bitcoin, but they're relatively anonymous. Instead of seeing the person's name and exactly what's happening, or like in the Ethereum network with a contract, instead of seeing that exact contract and how it's playing out and who's doing it, you just see enough anonymous information. You know it's there, you know it's valid based on the way your computer is validating that information, maintaining that information. but the ability to store it and maintain it is distributed to anybody who wants to run a Bitcoin full node, or anyone who wants to run an Ethereum full node. And that's you potentially with your own home computer, if you have enough space on it basically and enough power for it, downloading a full node and maintaining a full node of the network. And then you could also mine in a lot of these ecosystems. You can help validate blocks and support the network even further. But basically it just takes like the most pure forms of blockchain, in my opinion, and what it was really intended for, in my opinion, is to take the control out of large governments, large institutions, spread it to multiple people and their computers, like via nodes, like downloading a whole copy of the Bitcoin blockchain is you downloading that whole ledger of transactions onto your computer, and you're now running a full node, and you now are supporting this network without the intervention, as an individual, without the intervention of governments and of large businesses. And again, it takes that single point of vulnerability out, because you're housing a full copy of all the Bitcoin transactions on your computer via a full node. I'm doing that on my computer via a full node. There's people, tons of people throughout the world who are doing that and supporting the network. So if one node goes down, or if a bunch of nodes go down, go offline, there's still a copy, a record of your transactions housed on that blockchain on tons and tons and tons of other computers. So there's not a single business or government entity in control of the information, and there's not a single physical point of failure for that information. So yeah, I hope that makes a little bit more sense. The bottom line, it's a ledger system just like we've been using for centuries upon centuries upon centuries to track transactions and to track agreements between people, and in this case now track code that's being made into certain applications, which is also really nice, especially as our economy becomes a lot more digital. It's good to keep track of those types of contracts and transactions. But yeah, it's a ledger system that just tracks a bunch of information and houses it in a way that's different than server farms scattered throughout the world, and that's different than businesses and governments being the custodian of all that information. It distributes, it's more democratic, it distributes all of that information and the ability to store it and control it to the people that are using it. So yes, that's my rant. I hope it helped. If it did or didn't, or if you want to know more or anything like that, please leave a comment. I run a website called cryptkeepers.club. The gist of it, the intention of it was supposed to be about valuing different blockchain companies. So I think this is still a good video to have on like a landing page, or someone's like, what the heck is blockchain anyway? Boom, here's the link, here you go. But yeah, feel free to interact. I definitely look forward to like learning more about where the knowledge gaps are so we can try and help fill them, and you can participate in this world that is definitely designed to be a cool one when carried out in the right way.